Hi everyone, I'm your host, Arlen Schumer, and welcome to one of my pop culture presentations. Get ready to be both educated and entertained, what I call edutainment. And when you're done, please be sure to click the subscribe or follow button on your platform screen to be notified of all of my upcoming pop culture presentations. 1973. I had to choose that typeface to really resemble the early 70s. What do we remember from that year? In politics and world politics, there was the Arab-Israeli War, the Yom Kippur War, it was called. But it was probably overshadowed earlier that year by Watergate breaking wide open, as this great Jack Davis illustration shows. And you can see that Watergate would then result a year later in Nixon's resignation. But in 73, in the world of sports, it was the year that the Miami Dolphins became the only to date perfect team by winning the January Super Bowl for the 1972 undefeated season, and something which 50 plus years later has not been duplicated. In entertainment, the nostalgic Sting was probably the #1 movie of the year and the second great Newman Redford team up after Butch Cassidy and Sundance Kid from 1969. But in 1973, we were introduced to a new filmmaker, most of us, George Lucas, and American Graffiti, which really signified America looking back pre-Vietnam, pre-Beatles, to that simpler time. But 1973 in movies was also marked by, of course, The Exorcist, maybe the first modern horror film of our time, and caused uproar everywhere, and still one of the key marks of our pop culture. In music, Pink Floyd's immortal album, Dark Side of the Moon, was introduced in the spring. Another great English act of the time, Elton John, released one of the great double albums of all time, I believe in the fall, Goodbye Yellow Brick Road. But there were some American acts to compete. A little known singer-songwriter from New Jersey's album kicked off the year 1973, Bruce Springsteen's Greetings from Asbury Park, I believe on January 3rd. In the comic book world, in Marvel Comics, the biggest event of that year was the death of Gwen Stacy, Marvel Comics' biggest selling comic book that year. On the more artistic side of comics, it was Barry Smith's last great issue of Conan the Barbarian, The Song of Red Sonja, that he penciled, inked, and colored. And it's one of the great monuments of comic book art. And then Marvel introduced a character that would become much more prominent in the 21st century, Blade, the Vampire Slayer, and the fact that he was Black in 1973 did not go unnoticed because there were still so very few Black main characters of the time. It was also, of course, when the Colin Palmer team really solidified as one of the great artistic teams of comics. Marvel introduced another character. No, it wasn't Man-Thing. He was introduced in 71. We're going to talk about Man-Thing. But right at the end of 73 in the fall, yeah, Howard the Duck was introduced that year as well. Over at DC Comics, they dominated the headlines more. They started off the year by bringing back Captain Marvel after 20 years in limbo with its original artist, C.C. Beck. And then you also had Joe Kubert riding high, illustrating and adapting Edgar Rice Burroughs stories in Tarzan. Their most prominent artist, the artist of the time, Neil Adams, drew the long-awaited return of the Joker after many years from the camp era of the TV show. And that issue came out around June of 73. And it was the first of a couple of milestones in DC's history that dominated the 73 headlines. A month later in July, you had the debut of Michael Kaluta's Shadow, which was just that cover image alone, one of the great all-time covers. They also introduced Walt Simonson's Manhunter as a backup feature in the fall of '73 in Detective Comics with a great Jim Aparo cover there. But Batman also figures in the issue we're celebrating today that came out in August, early August, I believe, of 1973. And it was the long-awaited meeting of Swamp Thing and Batman. So welcome, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Arlen Schumer, and I wrote and designed a coffee table art book, The Silver Age of Comic Book Art, about comic book art in the 1960s, the Silver Age as opposed to the 1940s, the Golden Age. And inside on the contents page, you can see the 8 artists that I chose to focus on that I feel are the same way we look back on the Renaissance masters 500 years ago. I believe we'll be looking back 500 years from now that these were our great Renaissance masters of the human figure. And you can see that I tried to attach a quote by each one of them that kind of summed up their approach to their art. I gave each one of them, like Carmen Infantino, a double-page spread introduction where my type on the right of my introduction has an image ghosted behind it. The portrait on the left is their most significant character. Carmen Infantino, boy, the name Carmine means red, and he becomes associated with the red-suited superhero, the Flash. But you can see in the ghosted image behind my type, Infantino was kind of like the Jack Kirby of DC Comics in the 60s, in that he touched so many characters, as you can see here in this beautiful sketch drawing. And then in the issue that DC Comics put out at the end of 1967 to celebrate the fact that Infantino, at the height of his career, drawing almost every DC character, was coming to an end. And not because he was quitting comics, but because he was the first artist to be promoted to an executive position. You know, the last 30 years or so, Joe Quesada has been editor-in-chief, I think, of Marvel Comics. And he, you know, is a great artist, but it was Infantino the first, and especially an industry giant like DC. But that's because they were lagging behind Marvel Comics, Jack Kirby and Jim Steranko and Buscema and all those great art things. So Erwin Donenfeld, the son of the co-founder of DC Comics, had the smarts to make Infantino first the kind of art director of all the DC Comics covers, because his cover sold well. You can see him here in this photo, probably sketching out layouts for other artists to illustrate. But as you can see in this house ad that Infantino drew, he was kind of in charge of bringing in new artists, new titles that would enable DC to compete with Marvel. And just coincidentally, a 26-year-old wunderkind dynamo named Neil Adams came to DC Comics probably in early 67 or late 66. And Neil Adams is the artist of the decade and of the 1970s as well. His style was most, along with Jack Kirby's hyper-exaggerated style, Neil Adams' photorealism, bringing that to the world of fantasy superheroes is what enabled him to win award after award, as you can see here in the full-page house ad that they took out, in which Neil provided portraits of all of their winners. But yeah, it was, as he himself said, if superheroes really existed, they would have to look the way I draw them. And yeah, there's no photo reference for a shot like this. You got to know how to draw. But it was his realistic delineation of a fantasy superhero world that opened up the possibilities of comic book art. And if Neil Adams was the Beatles of comic book art at the end of the decade, then the next wave that came in after him were the Rolling Stones, the British invasion. In fact, one of them, the top there, Barry Smith of Conan fame, was British. And then there was the Southern American contingent. You had BERNI WRIGHTSON on the left from Baltimore. You had Michael Kaluta in the center, raised in Georgia. And, you know, Jeff Jones, I think, was also from Baltimore, although I might be wrong on that. But they came in at the dawn of the 70s in Neil Adams' wake. He literally hid artists like Mike Kaluta under his desk at DC Comics because DC didn't want any long-haired hippies in their offices. One of Neil Adams' many achievements. In the late 70s, their artwork, they all shared a studio, was brought together in an oversized book that's a collector's item today. And you can see in the examples in the collage on the cover, the very kind of Art Nouveau, very, very Rococo, very illustrative works that they all did. But of course, today, we're going to focus on one BERNI WRIGHTSON. This photo was taken probably in the late 70s. And here's a photo of what he looked more like in the late 60s, early 70s, probably about the same time he might have done this self-portrait. And you can see in even works like this, his heavy use of blacks, his lighting, his shading, and these early illustrations are the hallmarks that would make him one of the great gods of comic book art in the 20th century. But in these early examples of this time kind of Conan the Barbarian, here you have a kind of a science fiction-y image. Look at that early signature down at the bottom. But one of WRIGHTSON's biggest, if not the biggest influence on him artistically was the work of EC Comics from the 1950s, both their science fiction comics and their fantasy comics that were illustrated by, again, some of the gods of comic art, like this cover by Frank Frazetta. And Frank Frazetta deserves, of course, a webinar of his own, but you can see in this 1970 drawing how much of Frazetta is in WRIGHTSON. Look at this great shot of him meeting his hero, probably at the, I'm going to say the 1969 Comic Art Convention in New York City at the Statler Hilton, maybe, or 1970. But WRIGHTSON was born in 48. So yeah, he's like, you know, 2021 here. But eventually wound up at DC Comics, where one of the great editors. Oh, you know, I didn't mute everybody. Can I ask everybody to okay, I don't know if I can mute everybody now. I need everybody to just be quiet if you're hearing me. Anyway, it was Dick Giordano, a forward-thinking editor at DC, that saw WRIGHTSON's early work. And at the time, oops, what am I doing here? He's editing a comic book, The Spectre, for DC Comics. Here's a Nick Cardy cover. This is April of 1969. Remember, comics are done 3 to 4 months in advance. They're dated so that it encourages retailers to keep them out on the newsstands. But I was a fan of The Spectre. I was 11 years old at the time. And I remember getting this issue, and inside was a backup story of The Spectre by an artist who wasn't even credited. And I remember looking at this, and I didn't like the art. I thought it was crude looking. In fact, I thought it was a reprint from the 1940s. This wasn't your Murphy Anderson Spectre. This was a different, a ghostly, a ghastly Spectre, as you can see in samples like this. And I mean, you can see, again, this wasn't your father's Spectre. So it was this dark side of BERNI WRIGHTSON in 1970 samples like this, where you can begin to appreciate his fine line pen and ink technique that we're going to be seeing all during this webinar. But it was samples like this that caught the eye of DC editor Joe Orlando. This is probably a photo from the 80s, not the early 70s when he was editing DC Comics. But Joe Orlando goes back to the early 50s when he was one of the artists at EC Comics, those science fiction comics. In 1953, he illustrated one of EC's greatest stories, Judgment Day. I can't even go into it, but suffice it to say, it winds up with the first really realistic drawing of a black man in mainstream comic books coming in the early 50s. And that's a whole nother story. But at the time, Joe Orlando was in charge of DC titles like House of Secrets that had previously been doing kind of pseudo superhero stuff and converting them to mystery stories, horror stories. So living up to the original title, House of Secrets, which goes back to the 50s when it was more of a mystery title. There's a great cover by Neil Adams, who would end up doing all the great covers of House of Secrets for the next couple of years. But inside, Orlando would let Wrightson do these full page kind of frontispieces, maybe you would call them. And you can see the date, 1971 here. Here's House of Mystery, the last issue in April of 68, before it turned into the great hard title with the lettering by Gaspar Saladino, who we're going to talk about later. But here's the first of so many great House of Mystery covers that Neil Adams would illustrate. In 1970, perhaps his greatest story, and maybe one of his greatest covers, called Nightmare, in this particular issue, also featured one of BERNI WRIGHTSON's first full-color interior stories in a DC comic, The Secret of the Egyptian Cat. And you can see how he was able to sell some of his early illustrations, like this one, to DC Comics to turn it into a mystery cover. Of course, I chose the bat because the bat will play prominent in this webinar. So that was what was happening at DC. Now, over at Marvel, right around this time, one of their mainstays for decades, Sal Brodsky, their production manager, went off on his own to start a line of black and white comic magazines, not comic books, more like the Warren black and white comics. And he would have periodic lunches with Stan's good left arm. Yes, that's the young Roy Thomas, who at the dawn of the 70s was assuming his role as editorial director as Stan Lee would do less and less. And Roy Thomas recalls these lunches with Sal Brodsky about characters he could do. And I believe Thomas suggested he resurrect a character called the Heap. And sure enough, in the first issue of Psycho magazine, with a full-color painted cover dated March of 71, you have the most exciting character in years, the mind of a man in a body of earth matter. And you can see they modeled their whole look after the Warren black and white magazines, eerie and creepy. But you can see, yes, that's the Heap. And there he is, looking very Heap-like. Now, the idea of the Heap, before we go into his comic book incarnation, goes back to the great science fiction writer Theodore Sturgeon, whose maybe most famous novel was called More Than Human. But he was one of the great science fiction writers of the 20th century. 1940, as a young man, he publishes in the science fiction pulp magazine Unknown a story called It. Now, I don't have any images of the text. I only have this house ad put out by the publisher of the compilation in 1948 that the story It would appear in, called Without Sorcery. You can see introduction by Ray Bradbury. But that first story, which was about a kind of swamp monster who goes around killing indiscriminately as he just investigates its surroundings, at the end of the story, it's revealed that it was formed around the human skeleton. Well, back to 1942, 2 years after Sturgeon writes the story in Air Fighters Comics, I believe this is the Quality Comics group. Yes, there was a story called The Heap. He was a German fighter, Erich von Emmelmann, who you can see crashes in the Polish swamp. But the vines and creepers covered his body, merged with it, and became The Heap. Well, flash forward to 1971, and they changed it. They Americanized them, but you can see how, there it is. Now, a couple issues after the Heap's debut, he returns in the Skywolf backup feature, and you can see how he begins to develop that kind of snout. But the Heap becomes so popular that Airboy features him over the next 10 years, from 1942 to 1952. And the Heap was super popular. In fact, after he stops being published over in a rival publisher, Weird Mysteries, you get this story, The Swamp Monster. Now, astute comic art historians will look at this and know that that is the unmistakable work of the great Basil Wolverton. But the story of the Heap reappearing in 1971, at the same year as both the Man-Thing and Swamp Thing debut, the closest parallel would be 8 years earlier in 1963, when the story of a bunch of mutants led by a professor in a wheelchair, created by Jack Kirby, X-Men, appears 3 months after a bunch of mutants at DC Comics led by their professor in a wheelchair, called the Doom Patrol debut. And that's always been a coincidence. But 3 months is still 3 months. With the Heap, March of 71, 2 months later, Marvel Comics puts out a black and white magazine, Savage Tales. You can see the type on the left, The Coming of the Man-Thing. And in their editorial, it's a little tough to read the type, but basically, they credit editor Stan Lee with the title, The Man-Thing, that he handed off to remember his second in command, soon to be top dog, Roy Thomas. And Roy Thomas discusses who the artist should be, and they said the name Gray Morrow came up. Now, Gray Morrow is one of the great comic book artists, also of the 20th century.
Oh, Tracy. Tracy, I've got a question for you.
Hey,
would you have any objection?
Can you please be
quiet? To stick a nail in that wall and put it?
I didn't get to mute everybody. Please, can you please?
Right in the corner here.
Can you hear me?
Okay, I figured it's
Don't
kind
talk.
of space. I didn't want to just presume. If you ever want to swap out what I put up with something,
can you please be quiet?
Just let me know. Thanks.
Wow, I guess you can't hear me. Okay, well, you can see Gray Morrow's art on Man-Thing. Now, 2 months later, dated July, comes DC's House of Secrets with a BERNI WRIGHTSON, beautiful cover there. And it's in a story written by Len Wein. Len Wein, along with his friend Marv Wolfman, a couple of nice Jewish boys from Queens or Brooklyn, broke into the comics world at about the same time the artists like Wrightson and Kaluta were bringing. They were the writer equivalents. They teamed up for one of their first published Batman stories, dated February of 71, illustrated by Neil Adams. You can see their credit on the left there, Len Wein and Marv Wolfman. But Len Wein claims that he wrote the story for House of Secrets before he knew that Marvel was doing Man-Thing. He says he wrote it because BERNI WRIGHTSON, I mean, he decided to show it to BERNI WRIGHTSON, the story, because WRIGHTSON was going through a really bad breakup. And so much of the first Swamp Thing story is about heartbreak and loss. And Wein thought that WRIGHTSON would be the perfect artist to illustrate this script. Now, look at how WRIGHTSON first started out with a very rough magic marker color study here, and how refined the black and white brushwork and gray tones that he used. Now, if that woman looks familiar as art, that's because it was young Louise Jones. Louise Jones would later become Louise Simonson when she would marry Walt Simonson, I believe in the early 80s. But she was Louise Jones back in the day and married to, yes, Jeff Jones, who, of course, decades later would become Jeffrey Catherine Jones and have the sex change. But here he is in probably, again, the late 70s with BERNI WRIGHTSON. We return back to WRIGHTSON's black and white and gray ink wash. And this is Jack Adler, the head of coloring at DC Comics, who probably hand painted this black and white photostat of WRIGHTSON's wash drawing. And look at how it ended up printing in the finished cover. And it's really one of the most beautiful comic covers of all time. That issue opens up with another WRIGHTSON frontispiece featuring Cain and Abel, who are the hosts of House of Secrets and House of Mystery. But here's how the first Swamp Thing story starts. The narration by Wein, written for the monster, as we are introduced to him here on this beautiful splash page. I move slowly through the moss-draped mire, treading a path that is worn smooth. Memories that bring only pain. And this will be the first of many black and white original art versions of WRIGHTSON's beautiful art we're going to be seeing tonight. And I'm excited to be able to bring whatever I've been able to find off the internet for the last 15 years or so, I'm able to present tonight, so you can see how much is both gained by color or lost by color. So this first Swamp Thing story, and I can't really go into the details, but it's a gothic kind of triangle romance of rival lovers for the lady's attention, which of course yields to a kind of Cain and Abel bloodshed. But you can see in this one panel of the future Swamp Thing, almost cartoony looking, but again, you can see the beautiful line work and brush work by WRIGHTSON, almost Japanese-like, the white brush strokes on the lower right side of the panel. And I'm showing you these pages just to give you a sense of the story and how one of the male lovers murders the other, of course, so that he can have the hands of Linda, lovely Linda. And look at the photo reference that exists that WRIGHTSON was able to use. That's the artist Alan Weiss, another of the Young Turks who broke in at the dawn of the 70s. And you can see how he's plotting to, I don't know, I guess murder her and get her money. I forget what the details of the story are, but the villain of the story is played by artist Mike Kaluta, as you're going to see in this next sample, as the monster crashes through. Yes, that's young Mike Kaluta. and he exacts his revenge on the man that murdered him. He tries to appeal to Linda, but she's stunned by his appearance, horrified. And that's how the first Swamp Thing story ends. If tears would come, they would. The story ended up winning the Best Comic Book Story of the Year award. But notice how literally a month later at DC Comics, Neil Adams does not a Man Thing and not a Swamp Thing, but the Spectre of the Stalking Swamp. Now, Phantom Stranger happened to be written by Len Wein at the time, and you can see this story illustrated by Tony DeZuniga that comes out literally a month after that Swamp Thing story in House of Secrets. Meanwhile, over at Skywald, which was the name that Saul Brodsky chose, he gave the Heap his own full color issue, which encapsulated a retelling of his origin. And you can see they changed it to an American flyer crashing into chemicals, very, very Joker-like. And he becomes the Heap, the end of the beginning. And I think they kept publishing the Heap into 1972 for a couple of issues. Meanwhile, over in Marvel in 1972, in the month of June, you have a Man Thing story drawn by, I think this Man Thing story was I think written by Jerry Conway, maybe. It's a Neil Adams version of Man Thing done from his pencils, not from his black and white ink drawings, and that's what makes this art special. If you've never seen it, you should seek it out. So this ping pong of Man Thing and Swamp Thing is going back and forth over at DC on their news page. Look at the first paragraph there. The first is the Swamp Thing. You love the original story when it appeared in House of Secrets. It's even not yet. It would win that award. Well, on the lower half of this full page house ad, look at this ad. A different comic mag is coming. Notice Joe Orlando's name, the editor, is put first, then Len Wein, and then BERNI WRIGHTSON. But the image that accompanied it was the first snippet we would see of this different looking but similar looking Swamp Thing. Now, this illustration exists from 1972. Maybe this was meant to be the cover of the first issue. It has an interesting inscription, like one who on a lonely road, both walk in fear and dread, and having once turned round, walks on, and turns no more his head, because he knows a frightful fiend doth close behind him tread. Well, I don't know what to make of it, but it's an early Wrightson great image of Swamp Thing. And then this house ad appears. Now, before we go into the very degenerated cover on the right, it was also that logo that seemed really new and different. And it's one of the DC letterer named Gaspar Saladino, who kind of succeeded the great Irish Schnapp at DC in the 1970s and would go on to become one of the great industry letterers. And the Swamp Thing might be one of his greatest logos of so many that he did, because it looks and feels like the very swamp that Wrightson beautifully illustrates the Swamp Thing emerging from in the black and white original art to issue 1. Here's Jack Adler's first color print markup, and you can see color-wise that they changed the blue background behind the Swamp Thing logo in the finished cover to a deeper purple. But behind this beautiful first issue of the Swamp Thing appearing at the end of 1972, it begins with really declaring what they knew was indeed a new kind of graphic excitement, the saga of the Swamp Thing. And in this first full page splash panel, pun intended, Wrightson gets to do his evocation of the swamps and the Everglades. I think this takes place in Florida. And there is the new Swamp Thing in the first splash page, Dark Genesis. And we're going to note over time the different ranges of newsprint coloring that Wrightson was able to achieve, whether he colored some of these or they were colored by Tatiana Wood or Jack Adler. I don't think anybody knows for sure. But you can see in this very first issue, they plan a new origin for Swamp Thing. Dr. Alec Holland, research scientist, and his wife. I forget, was she named Linda in this story as well? But yeah, you can see that the future Wrightson milieus of the laboratory flasks and lamps and science fiction knickknacks Wrightson indulges right from the start. Of course, he runs afoul of the bad guys who subdue him. And as he finds to his chagrin, when he awakens, they've planted a bomb right under the desk of his laboratory. And yes, Boiroom. And we get the kind of Swamp Thing Stations of the Cross origin of all the swamp monsters, going back to Theodore Sturgeon's It, of the human carcass making its way to the regenerative powers of the swamp, that Wrightson again beautifully illustrates the first of his many to come metamorphosis of Swamp Thing out of the swamp and into that distinctive cowl, or whatever you describe his face. Speaking of which, we get the first great close-up of the Swamp Thing. The classic BERNI WRIGHTSON, Len Wein Swamp Thing right there. And there's the beautiful black and white line work. I wish we had the time, folks, to just dwell on the beautiful line work on display in so many of the Swamp Thing pages, but we must move on. When you watch the recording later, you can pause it and stare at these masterpieces as long as you want. Anyway, Linda, yes, he doesn't get back in time to save her from being shot and killed by the gangsters that blew up his lab. So the Swamp Thing, of course, goes on a rampage. He confronts their car. Ferret, what a perfect name for the bad guy. Stop, I said. Stop. Yeah, one of the great Swamp Thing full pages. You kind of feel the impact there of that car crash. And there's the very first Swamp Thing's letters page, in which BERNI Wrightson gets to do portraits of his partner, Len Wein, who I'm assuming wrote the text here with bios of both Wein and Wrightson. They were both born the same year, 1948, met up in New York City at the dawn of the transition of the 60s into the 70s. And he mentions Bad Time Stories, which is a book Wrightson put out at the same time as Swamp Thing came out, which was made up of a lot of his early stories that dabbled in those EC science fiction, Frank Frazetta influenced pieces and offbeat adventure stories like King of the Mountain Man. But it's funny that Swamp Thing 1 was a smash, and literally a month later, Marvel debuts Man-Thing in his own color comic after the black and white appearance by Gray Morrow and that penciled story by Neil Adams. And that's a Neil Adams cover, believe it or not. Yeah, his Marvel covers aren't as recognizable as his DC covers. And the interior was done by one of the Continuity Comics crusty bunkers, I think Rich Buckler, That's how he broke into comics, I think, through Neil Adams, one of many in the 70s. And then Roy Thomas suggested, hey, why don't we adapt it? Because it is the original Swamp Thing, the original Man Thing. So the same month, they get Jim Steranko to illustrate the adaptation of the Theodore Sturgeon story, illustrated by Maurice Severin and Frank Giacoia. But yeah, this appears right after Swamp Thing 1. But here's the beautiful cover to Swamp Thing 2. And each one of these early covers is really a mini masterpiece by Wrightson. Just, we could ogle the brushwork and just the composition of the figures. I mean, that's what these Swamp Things are. They're really where Wrightson made his bones in the comic book world. You know, Simonson was doing it with Manhunter. Kaluta would end up doing it with The Shadow. And Wrightson did it really first before both of them with Swamp Thing. And again, just beautiful splash page with such beautiful line work. Swamp Thing runs afoul of these ghastly creatures who overpower him, but this is the kind of stuff Wrightson loved to draw. So as a writer, Len Wein was writing to Wrightson's strengths, and I don't know the details whether they co-plotted or not, but there's a nice drawing of Swamp Thing wrestling with a ghastly python. And then you get this incredible image, which maybe stands out as maybe Wrightson's greatest single full-page Swamp Thing image. The Christological illusions are there, but it's really a masterpiece, especially in its black and white original art stage. But man, I don't think you can find a better full-page Wrightson Swamp Thing image than this one. But we must go on. So Swamp Thing's fighting on the precipice there at the top, and that's when we meet arch-villain Arcane, who will become Swamp Thing's bête noire and emphasis. And yeah, I know what you're thinking with that beautiful bottom panel, of course, from the Sistine Chapel, but that's definitely what Wrightson evokes here with that beautiful background and that sensitive drawing. So Arcane, of course, wants to get Swamp Thing into a kind of satanic ritual in which he will be able to exchange life forces and bodies so that he becomes the Swamp Thing and the Swamp Thing becomes human again. There's a great Swamp Thing intense expression. Sensitive coloring there. I bet you Wrightson colored this issue. And yes, he becomes human. He's Alec Holland again. And as Arcane explains, you will remain providing the enchantment is not disturbed. Well, you know where this story is heading, folks. Yep, Alec Holland realizes he can't go on living a lie and allowing Arcane to have the strength of the Swamp Thing's body. So, of course, he puts a kibosh. You unmitigated idiot. Do you know what you have done? I know, Arcane. I know. And there's some beautiful coloring, folks, going through the color scale as Wrightson chops up in an almost cinematic framework. Issue 3 in early 73 in its beautiful black and white form. Don't you love these covers without any word balloons or blurbs? Just beautiful, artistic mini masterpieces by Wrightson. Just like every one of these early splash pages are just gorgeous examples of Wrightson's line work, his lighting, and just the beautiful comic book coloring in this to distinguish foreground from background. But this story is mainly Wrightson getting to illustrate one of his fave characters, basically Frankenstein, though he's not named Frankenstein. It's a character Wrightson's been enamored with since childhood. This is a 1971 illustration, going back to the Boris Karloff film, obviously. After Swamp Thing at Warren, he would do the story, The Muck Monster, which is essentially, as you can see here, him getting to do Frankenstein again. And then later in the 70s, his magnum opus, the incredible black and white pen and ink illustrations for his adaptation of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, maybe the greatest body of black and white pen and ink work, I think, in black and white pen and ink work history. I'm going to have to do a webinar on that one of these days. Even posthumously, they've taken Wrightson's Frankenstein. This is a recent color illustration of one of Wrightson's Frankenstein images that was published after Wrightson passed away. But back to Swamp Thing, you can see how this particular character, the Patchwork Man, was, of course, once human, but he ran afoul of Arcane, who used him as an experiment to see if he can transmit somebody's consciousness into body parts and animate them. And sure enough, he became, oh, I guess he's Arcane's brother. Yes, I forget. It was his brother. The good Arcane turned into the Patchwork Man. Look at this beautiful vertical design that Wrightson employs in this sequence in a double page spread that just really takes your eye across, and you really get the feeling of the Swamp Thing falling. A perfect use of the form of the vertical panels to harmonize with the actual mise en scene, I believe is the French term. But as you can see, Arcane believes that this new character introduced, Abigail Arcane, is his daughter, and he will do anything to save her from the mob. But he goes too far. The Swamp Thing must intervene, and we get a great battle between Swamp Thing and kind of Frankenstein by BERNI WRIGHTSON. Yeah, that's a monumental panel of Swamp Thing, is it not? Once again, we could ogle that brushwork till the cows come home. But in the end, Gregory Arcane redeems himself and saves his daughter, Abigail, who in a fleeting moment recognizes him as her father, and he sacrifices himself. Well, that was great. Wrightson getting to do Frankenstein. How about the next issue where Wrightson gets to do, yes, one of the great werewolf stories in comics. Now, 5 years earlier, in 1968, I think the other great modern werewolf story in comics was done, and that would be by the great Jim Steranko in the 3rd issue of Nick Fury, Agent of S.H.I.E.L.D. Look at that beautiful Gothic cover, and one of the great double-page spread title pages of all time. Dark Moon Rise, Hellhound Kill. Anyway, back to the cover of Swamp Thing 4, another mini masterpiece, especially when viewed in its black and white original art form. Look at that cross-hatching, folks. It's a thing of beauty, but when it's beautifully colored, you get the perfect mix. Remember, folks, this is not computer coloring. These are hand-cut screens, but when they're done right with care and love, you get mini masterpieces like this. Another incredible splash page by Wrightson. The use of Zipatone, that's the gray pattern in the background. That was black and white printing on acetate with adhesive that you would paste down to your black and white original art to achieve effects like that, as you can see in the black and white original art. And Gaspar Saladino lettered these stories, so you get some great titles Monster on the Moors. But it's all about that Wrightson artwork. It's all about these delineations of Swamp Thing. And yeah, that beautiful cross hatching. I mean, folks, look at that blood, sweat, and tears that Wrightson put in to this full page Swamp Thing spectacular from that issue. And again, a black and white mini masterpiece as well. But these are beautifully colored, so I love both. There's a good close-up of Abigail, Arcane. Again, it's a cross between realism and cartooniness that Wrightson was kind of a master of. But look at that introduction of the werewolf coming out of the foggy mist that Wrightson delineates with this beautiful cross hatching. And then the great panel. Oh man, that's like a Roman sculpture, a Greek sculpture. Ah, don't you love it? You get one of the great transformations that every werewolf story must have. And then you get one of the great werewolf faces revealed by Wrightson. Ah, you gotta love this full pager. Everything about it. The black and white artwork, the cross hatching, the zipatone. And the printed newsprint color. How about this close up of both Abigail Arcane and the werewolf? Oh, that's cross hatching on the level of Robert Crumb. It's really beautiful. And then you get this beautiful Swamp Thing appearance. Once again, the sensitivity of the coloring to make you feel the light coming up from below to harmonize with Wrightson's expressive brushwork. You can also see a lot of the Joe Kubert influence on Wrightson. The way he inks, his freeness with his brushstrokes. Now, I bet you this story probably was what Wrightson was working on, maybe just after Neil Adams must have been working on his classic Joker story that appears a couple months before that Swamp Thing story. But I bet you he loved what Wrightson was doing so much that he must have asked Len Wein to say, hey, why don't you write a werewolf story for me? Well, a year later in 1974, you'd get Neil Adams' last Batman story of the 1970s. And it's his take on the great werewolf image, also written by Len Wein, as you can see here on the great splash page. This story was so influential that a couple decades later, it would wind up as an episode of the great Batman animated series in the 1990s, also written by Len Wein. Anyway, speaking of mini masterpieces, Wrightson just kept topping himself issue after issue with these beautifully composed covers that are just silent with no extra verbiage, beautifully colored. Look at that sky gradation. Just, again, a mini masterpiece. And it started out in Wrightson's rough pencil sketch, although that's a pretty tight sketch of the people there. But you can see how Wrightson had the whole balance of the composition. There's the black and white pen and ink and brushwork original art. And then, of course, I wish I knew exactly who colored that, but it's really just one of Wrightson's great Swamp Thing images. You can see he worked on it between 72 and 73, but comics are usually, again, 6 months in advance. Interesting splash page. We get to see a great Swamp Thing and some classic Wrightson caricaturish faces in close-up. We can again admire that beautiful brushwork. How about Swamp Thing emerging Always a great image, but again, beautifully colored, just stunning. This issue also enabled Wein and Wrightson to do a kind of recap of the Swamp Thing's origin in one page. So you get Alec and Linda Holland, the explosion, and we get to see Wrightson draw Swamp Thing in utero, in gestation, that he didn't draw in issue 1. We also get to see, in addition to a great close-up of the Swamp Thing's eye, his ability to regenerate in this 9-panel page with some great Swamp Thing figures. We get the recapitulation of the cover image in the narrative part of the story, but it ends with just one of the great Swamp Thing close-ups. And folks, please acknowledge the beautiful coloring. Again, these are hand-cut screens. Not, it's not computer coloring, but this is what I love about great comic book coloring encapsulated in a single image. Now, why am I showing you the letter column, Swamp Things? Well, remember issue 1? I don't know who lettered Swamp Things, but you know who lettered this beautiful version? Yeah, BERNI WRIGHTSON himself. There's the original art. And notice, so here's the next issue. I think this is the issue I came in on Swamp Thing. I was such a superhero zombie back then. If it wasn't about a guy in a skin-tight latex outfit, I wasn't interested. But only because I had been hearing and reading about so many great things about the Swamp Thing, I finally decided, let me check this thing out. So we get a great clash between Swamp Thing and a classic Wrightson alien-looking robot crow something. Interesting splash page, different from all the others, but with an interesting kind of meta Swamp Thing within a Swamp Thing. So Wrightson was equally at home with these Gothic interiors, classic old man in a Swiss clock shop, as well as his love of the kind of Hollywood influence, mechanization, science fiction-y milieus as well. Here's a great Swamp Thing figure bursting on the scene. The reason why I'm showing you this particular full page is because it's one of the few pages I do have the black and white original art from. It's not necessarily, one of the great pages, but hey, it's still always worth studying Wrightson in his prime on Swamp Thing. The issue ends with the classic clock sequence and Swamp Thing on his way, next stop Gotham City, Night of the Bat. Beautiful figure work of Swamp Thing in repose. And once again, it's interesting that Swamp Thing was bi-monthly. The very next month, Neil Adams does another version of Man-Thing, a fully painted cover for one of Marvel's black and white magazines. And I think that's the last time he'll illustrate Man-Thing. But a month later, you get the issue that was so long awaited. I mean, in those days, there was limited amount of comic book fandom, but what existed was really beating the drum for this particular issue. Why? Because at the time, Neil Adams was the Batman artist of the late 60s and early 70s. You can see him here sketching out a Batman drawing. What he did with Batman was go back to his 1939 Bob Kane graphic image, but he updated it in his realistic style for mini masterpieces like this, which I used as the foundation image for one of the many webinars I've done on Neil's work, calling him the greatest Batman artist of all time. He would take a classic Jack Burnley Batman image from 1941 or so, classic Batman and Robin in the spotlight, but just once again do a more realistic version where he really made Batman's cape come alive. I remember gasping out loud at this image of Batman in a cape that couldn't possibly exist. But all of a sudden, in May of 1972, we get this incredible image. Here's the half-page house ad, lettered by Gaspar Saladino. And if you know your comic art, you'll recognize that while this is a Neal Adams pencil drawing, the inks are not by Neal Adams. Who did those inks? Well, first of all, this image started out a year earlier in a convention sketch that Neal Adams did in felt tip marker, I believe. And man, this is a thing of beauty. I wish there was a year, but I think it's circa 1971 or so. But Julius Schwartz must have seen it. He said, Neal, turn it into cover. So Neal penciled it. And yes, those inks are by BERNI WRIGHTSON. And it's one of the great Batman covers of all time. It's been merchandised. This is like a three-dimensional picture box. It's a shoji screen. I have one of these in my apartment. You can wear it. You can drink it. But yeah, when this cover appeared in May of 72, it was the first time that a non-Neal Adams artist appeared on the cover in the inks of BERNI WRIGHTSON. The same month, by the way, his studio mate, Mike Kaluta, was the first artist to break Neal Adams' 3-year streak of Detective Comics covers, going back to 1969, with this radical image of Batman's cape, which would prove to be a major influence on everybody from Walt Simonson to Frank Miller to Todd McFarlane. So all of these images came into play with our excitement. How would BERNI WRIGHTSON handle Batman and Swamp Thing? In early August, this hit the newsstands. Here's the splash page. Now, I wish I had the entire black and white inked art. I only have half. But once again, we could just sit here and study the beautiful line work of BERNI WRIGHTSON, even if it's not the entire piece. Look at the sensitive coloring on this page. Oh, even in destruction, WRIGHTSON is lyrical and poetic. Once again, I'm showing you this page because we happen to have the black and white original art. Nice use of Zipatone in the center panel. And then we finally get to see Bruce Wayne in his private elevator towards his penthouse apartment. We get to see Alfred, and we finally get to see WRIGHTSON doing Batman. And man, we lived for these images, folks. I had to fasten a drool cup to my chin. I remember when this came out. I was 14 years old. Classic down by the docks in Gotham City scene. So WRIGHTSON gets to do his Batman. Look at that beautiful draped cape in the center panel. Nice punch. A great billowing cape. Another great fight scene where WRIGHTSON gets to strut his stuff. Beautiful figure work in the left panel. Right? Every panel is a gem. And then you get the fine line cross hatching in this beautiful last panel. Oh, I would love to blow that up to the size of a wall. Great. Of course, Swamp Thing was keeping busy in another part of Gotham City in a great panel here that I felt I had to show you of. Once again, you get the impact, but you get the fine line cross hatching in the night sky lit by the old-fashioned lamp. Great trench coat by WRIGHTSON. These are all like film noir icons that he got to do in Swamp Thing. Ah, Batman blending into the shadows in the left panel. And then we get the masterpiece, the pieta of Wrightson's Batman. This figure, the black and white art. Oh, look at the city in the background. But it's that cape. It's the billowing. It's the feeling that you're watching a Batman film. You can feel the wind. But man, that's Wrightson creating one of the iconic Batman images of all time. Let's take one last look at the whole page as a unit. Boy, I bet you the original art for that page goes for a pretty penny. That's what it looks like in black and white, folks. Man, just take it all in. Yeah, we drooled over every panel. Wrightson getting to do the Batman, probably of his dreams. Great close-up, grimace. And then finally, they meet Swamp Thing and Batman in the alleys. Look at that great Batman figure, the stylization of the cape. The battle. Boy, Wrightson doesn't disappoint. That figure on the right is just eternal. Man, you can feel that panel, but you can also just study it as a singular work of art. The fight continues, punch for punch. Finally, the Swamp Thing says, okay, enough of this. And with one punch, he knocks Batman out. But man, look at that center panel of the beautifully draped cape over Batman's prone figure splayed on the floor. And then we get to the final Wrightson masterpiece of the issue, this panel. Oh, how do I love thee? Let me count the ways. The cross-hatched background, the drape of the cape. You know, in that Batman Joker Neil Adams issue, there was a great panel that Adams drew of Batman emerging from the water and how his cape would drape. And here, just a couple months later, we get Wrightson in this masterpiece. I'm showing you how the story ends on a half page. Wrightson showing a teaser for the next issue, mainly because I wanted to show you the letter column, only a half page, Swamp Things, because Joe Rushnack says, incidentally, I've heard that the Swamp Thing is due to meet Batman in a forthcoming issue. I look forward to seeing the Cape Crusader as the frightening avenger he should be, and I'm quite sure that Bernie is going to show Neil Adams what it's all about. Well, folks, you just saw it, did he? Adams, after 1974, would continue kind of once a year, maybe, to put out a great Batman image like this wraparound tabloid-size cover, collecting his 1972 trilogy. Licensing the DC calendar, this was the month that he got, 1976 or so, maybe. And then in the 80s, he would contribute pinups like this. And then, of course, in the 21st century, in 2009, he returned to DC Comics doing a Batman interior saga that he wrote and drew, Batman Odyssey. Now, BERNI WRIGHTSON got to do his take on Batman in July of 72, before he did the Swamp Thing issue. He did this cover. Now, this is a 1980 issue of Batman, and yet that's not a 1980 illustration. Look at the signature, 1972. We happen to have the black and white original art, and you can see by the binding type on the left, yeah, this was intended for a 1972 issue of Batman. This page exists, dated 1975. That shows that maybe it started back then, but again, looks like Wrightson never finished it. Later in the 70s, we get this 1978 poster image with a great image of Batman in repose, the thinker. In the 80s, Wrightson would return to DC Comics to illustrate Batman. This is circa 1988. After the whole Dark Knight success, I think Wrightson did projects, I think because of their sales potential. And he would do a lot of things like this. You can see this image is dated 1991 in the lower right corner there, but it ended up being published posthumously in 2019, I believe, when Detective Comics celebrated its 1000th issue. In the 90s, he did miniseries like this with painted covers, but he wouldn't only face an alien, he still faced Swamp Thing, which was kind of an alien, in either commissioned illustrations like this or like this. Now, speaking of Swamp Thing and Batman, after that issue 7, the final 3 issues that Wrightson did were a little bit anticlimactic. Something felt different about these issues. They were still beautifully drawn. Wrightson getting to do one of his great motifs, these slithering, eel-like alien beings. We do have a great snowy scene, cross-hatched masterpiece by Wrightson. I wish I had the black and white original art to this. Just a beautiful figure by Wrightson of the Swamp Thing. How about this full page of Swamp Thing encountering this being, Munagala, I believe is the pronunciation. But again, we can study that Swamp Thing figure, the beautiful pen and ink line work, and then the gooey, drippy, blob-like being that Wrightson loves to draw. Of course, it began with a human being messing with the occult, releasing Munagala. Yeah, interesting full page, almost psychedelic. But there's the black and white original art. I wish I had a high resolution copy. That's the best I can get, but still. And then Wrightson brings the story to a climax with this incredible outer space illustration, beautifully colored too. Some nice Swamp Thing panels. And that's the end of that issue. Issue 9 has one of the greatest Wrightson Swamp Thing covers of all time. Just an iconic masterpiece, beautiful in black and white. But you couldn't ask for better comic book coloring than what you get on this cover. Again, whether it's Jack Adler, BERNI WRIGHTSON himself. But man, back then they didn't produce posters. DC should have made a poster of this. But you can see how influential this image has been on future artists. This is the kind of stuff I find on the web. I don't even have a name to credit this artist, but you can see the homage in this image too. And yeah, that's the great Alex Ross doing his take on Swamp Thing 9. Inside, nice train sequence by Wrightson. The coloring is a little flat in this issue. I don't think he or Jack Adler did the coloring, but there's the black and white art. And you got some great Wrightson cartoony horror faces. And then you turn the page and yeah, again, coloring is a little flat, but a nice Swamp Thing figure where you really get a feeling for his weight, his bulk. And then this nice sequence as he jumps from the train. We get Wrightson doing the Swamp Thing in a nice motion sequence. And then the final panel. I mean, folks, that's how you delineate bulk and movement and knowing when to use solid blacks. You can really feel the strut of the Swamp Thing and his arms as they hang by his side. And again, just a masterpiece of a panel on a page that I'm showing you because yes, there's the black and white line art. And just study that last panel, folks. But yeah, I thought this issue was kind of flatly colored. But here's the alien. Wrightson gets to draw again, a kind of a homage to EC and Wally Wood. But there's the black and white masterpiece. Look at those brush strokes, folks. The line work. It's just Wrightson at its early peak. But yeah, coloring's kind of flat. And then we get to the final issue, June of 1974. So basically, Wrightson worked on Swamp Thing all through 73 and most of 72. And in this final issue, we get the first issue where he's credited for both the plot and the art. So something tells me this is how Wrightson wanted to go out on the Swamp Thing. You know, meeting those monthly deadlines or even bi-monthly with the amount of work Wrightson put in was too much. So we get to meet a familiar ugly face. Again, very flat coloring. You know, I would have loved to see much more variety, but nevertheless, yes, that is Arcane. As you can see in these close-ups. Nice physical drawings in the two bottom panels. I love the twistiness. Again, it looks like a Greek or Roman sculpture on the left. But the coloring, again, is very flat. This looks like a masterpiece panel by Wrightson, but again, kind of done in by the very flat coloring. Nevertheless, it's a great climax to the story with three great close-ups in a row by Wrightson. And then you get the final page. It's actually the penultimate page, but it feels like the final page. It is almost dawn when the Swamp Thing awakens, rubbing the filth of sleep from his eyes to find he is alone. Arcane, Black Jubal, the others are gone. And the centuries-old cemetery is just as it was before. Or is it? For now there are 7 new headstones rising against the mist. 6 small and 1 large, and the Swamp Thing wonders if perhaps he should wait for the rising sun to examine this new mystery more closely. He wonders this for only an instant, then sanity prevails. And he turns away, shambling off into the misty half-light of morning. For there really is no need for him to stay. In his heart, the Swamp Thing knows what he will find. And thus ends Wrightson's tenure on the Swamp Thing. I think Len Wein would go on to write future iterations. But look at this letter in the final letter column. Neil Adams was always my favorite artist until I read Swamp Thing. BERNI WRIGHTSON is the stop-action camera of Neil Adams' videotape replay. The thing that most impressed me in issue 7 was similar to Bernie's style of Wally Wood. Maybe it's thinking. Bernie never had a real project like this magazine before, and his zeal is showing. This was the same enthusiasm that Neil had for Spectre, Deadman, and Green Arrow. Now Bernie fills the void left when Neil's and Gray Morrow's work at DC dwindled away. Well, that might be true. Wrightson would go on every now and then to illustrate Swamp Thing. Here in 1974, a year after he quit the bi-monthly color comic. Sometimes he would draw swamp monsters who weren't exactly Swamp Thing, like this one he did in 1974, that comes from the BERNI WRIGHTSON Monsters coloring book. Yes, it was made up of black and white reproductions like this. It wasn't Swamp Thing, but yes, it was definitely a swamp creature. And that I think he ended up coloring this one himself. In 77, he did the cover for the July 77 Phil Suling convention that was in Philadelphia, I believe, for the first time after 10 years in New York City. But you can see how this illustration recalls that great masterpiece of Swamp Thing 5. Also in 77, you had Wrightson doing a brand new cover, and not just a cover, a wraparound cover for a reprint collection. And while that's a beautiful full color masterpiece, check it out in its black and white, beautifully rendered form, but beautifully colored as well. Look at Wrightson's magic marker comp, as it's called, a kind of a sketch to get the main elements down. In the same way, look at this black and white double page spread for another Swamp Thing reprint collection that he then turns into this black and white pen and ink masterpiece. Look at that cross hatching in the background, folks, which then became this beautiful wraparound cover, again with some really nice coloring. In the 21st century, Wrightson did a series of trading cards for a company called FPG that were collected in this book with, again, it's not Swamp Thing, it's Swamp Thing-like. Or maybe that is Swamp Thing. No, I think it's Swamp Thing-like. The book was made up of the trading cards and their pencil drawings. And you can see, once again, it's not Swamp Thing, but it's Swamp Thing-like. And over the rest of Wrightson's life and career, many of these, I'm assuming, were commissions by fans. Either give me Swamp Thing or give me Swamp Thing-like. I think this one is Swamp Thing. The other one was Swamp Thing-like. Now, this one looks like a Swamp Thing-like. Pretty cool, though, fully painted. Whereas this one has that familiar Swamp Thing kind of cowl, as I refer to it. And yeah, it will always be Swamp Thing that Wrightson's career in the first line of his resume will always read, because he created, with his partner Len Wein, an immortal character that became his signature character in a career filled with so much incredible art, so beloved as BERNI WRIGHTSON, one of the greatest comic book artists, really, of the 20th century into the 21st. He passed away in 2017, in March, I believe, at the age of 66. And Len Wein, his longtime Swamp Thing partner, passed away about 6 months later, same age. But folks, we were here today to honor their great co-creation and perhaps the pinnacle of their partnership on Swamp Thing. Swamp Thing #7, When Swamp Thing Met Batman. So thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for being here. If you go to my website, arlenschumer.com, it's broken up into separate pages, like this page about my works in comic book history, most notably my book, The Silver Age, which you can get a signed and sketched in by me copy of, linked from my website. I run a Silver Age group on Facebook, as well as one for Jack Kirby's work in the Silver Age and beyond, and the artist who influenced me and a whole generation the most, Neil Adams. You can see on my homepage of my website, my illustration work broken up into 8 categories, and you'll see the Neil Adams influence all over my work. I'm also linked to a commercial site, TeePublic, where you can get over 125 of my illustrations on every kind of application you could think of. My visual lectures and webinars page is linked to both my YouTube channel, which has most of my comic book history and other pop culture history webinars, and my Vimeo channel, which has all the subject matter that YouTube's lawyers flagged for copyright infringement. And if you go to the events blog page, I always post my comings and goings with all the URL links that you'll need. So ladies and gentlemen, thank you again for being here at the 50th anniversary of Swamp Thing meeting Batman, and I hope to see you further on up the road. Bye-bye. Thanks for attending this presentation. Hope you enjoyed it.
And please remember to click the subscribe or follow button on your platform screen to be notified of all of my upcoming pop culture presentations. And visit my website, arlenschumer.com, to sign up for my newsletter too. Until next time, I'm Arlen Schumer. Bye-bye.